Welcome to Japan Unleashed. Welcome to Japan Unleashed, where we take a deep look into important issues facing Japan. I'm your host, Parker Allen, President and CEO of Parthenon Japan. This episode of Japan Unleashed is the sixth and final episode of our six-part series on Japan's regional revitalization. I am joined today by my good friend, fellow Japan specialist, Parthenon Japan Senior Advisor, and co-contributor to this series, David Wagner. David, thank you so much for being a part of this program. And wow, looking back, we have uncovered a lot of the issues facing rural Japan.
Yeah, we have, and I hope people have, learned a thing or two. I know I did in the process of researching all of this. This series has touched so much on relevant topics for Japan's future, and I'm particularly looking forward to today's discussion on opportunities for global business in rural Japan.
Right. As David noted, in this sixth part of our series on revitalizing Japan, we are going to discuss some of the many areas where businesses can flourish, especially in rural Japan. While we have focused on the reasons for Japan's rural decline in previous podcasts, we think there are many reasons to be optimistic, and we want to highlight the expanding business horizon. What are some of the investment opportunities? Which areas have the greatest business potential? We're going to explore the landscape today.
As you can probably guess, the list of reasons why moving to Japan and living in rural Japan makes sense. It's a slower paced life with more and cheaper space to live in, lower overall cost of living. The benefits of cultural immersion, natural beauty, and a sense of community surely top the list, and we agree. However, with the many pluses are some of the obvious challenges of living in rural Japan, including the depopulation issue, which we've discussed numerous times, labor shortages, and various services that are not on par with some urban areas. Throughout our series, we have not ignored these issues. However, let's focus today on how businesses can take advantage on the many public and private incentives available across the nation.
From a business perspective, rural Japan offers many businesses lower operating costs, access to less expensive labor, reduced competition, and even an abundance of natural resources. There are also business advantages highlighted by the Japanese government, which serve as an additional inducement. Let's take a look.
Yeah, through my research on this series, I've seen endless financial incentives and tax policies available, which are aimed at private sector growth in the rural sector and even the urban areas. And as discussed in earlier podcasts, the key is a collaboration between the public and private sectors.
The Japanese government and ruling coalition have recently agreed to offer tax schemes whereby proceeds from stock sale profits may be applied towards startup investments. Under this plan, up to 2 billion yen, or about $15 million in stock trading profits will be tax exempt when reinvested into startups. This is an innovative idea.
Yeah.
Day traders with a heart could make Japan a better place.
And there are lots of day traders here. On that note, the government might want to consider going even one step further by offering an additional enticement to those receiving inheritance from loved ones upon death. In exchange for providing a certain percentage of one's inheritance to targeted startups, the overall inheritance tax bill would be reduced. This would help startups and also give Japan residents one more reason to call Japan home.
That is a great idea, David, and I hope someone from the Japanese government is listening to this episode because, if they're going to let day traders do it, why not let people who are receiving inheritance do it?
Well, and the inheritance issue is a big topic, right? If you are a permanent resident here or a long-term resident and you've been here more than 5 years, and someone dies and left you something overseas and they've never lived in Japan, they never made any money in Japan, you still have to pay inheritance tax on it. It's crazy.
That ain't cool.
It's a lot of reason why people I know have left.
Yeah. Well, tax revisions are a crucial part of spurring growth in Japan, and targeting business spending is an obvious target. One recent tax revision of note promotes the introduction of 5G technology through tax credits. Due to this revision, corporations are now entitled to vie for either a 30% special depreciation rate or a 15% tax credit when investing in internet infrastructure. Introduced as part of the 2020 Tax Reform Act, this is an excellent way to get the private sector more involved in important change.
Yeah, and another recent incentive appears in the form of special tax treatment for investment in certain types of business equipment. Small and medium-sized companies may claim accelerated depreciation of 100% on core acquisition costs, or claim a special tax credit equivalent of 10% of the base acquisition cost on designated equipment with a maximum tax credit of 20% on the taxpayer's corporate liability. That is confusing, but it sounds good on paper. Spend the money to make money. We like it.
I like it too. And I think I'm going to need to set up a meeting with my accountant. There is also Japan's Open Innovation Tax Incentive, which allows companies to deduct from their taxable income 25% of share purchase amounts in startups for partnerships and other similar business arrangements. Another inducement is the incentive for new investment into production facilities, which permits any industry that invests in new production facilities to claim either a 30% special depreciation or 3% tax credit on acquisition costs, up to 20% of corporate tax liability. These incentives should further spur interest in production expansion in rural areas.
Yeah, one would think so. And there are additional tax enticements to promote investment in innovative corporations, quote unquote, innovative corporations, whereby a corporation that acquires shares of a venture company is eligible for a special income deduction. Invest in a new venture and get a tax deduction. This is precisely what rural Japan needs.
A similar offering can be found via the Internet of Things, or IoT. There is an investment tax incentive which is linked to costs related to the development of data gathering and analytic information systems. A part of the Innovative Data Utilization Plan, companies can benefit from either accelerated depreciation of 30% or a simple tax credit of 3 to 5% if they have acquired software as well as machinery or equipment worth 50 million yen or more.
That sounds complicated.
Again, the government is stimulating investment in rural Japan by reducing taxes in target industries if you can figure out what the incentives actually do.
Well, that's what you have accountants to do.
Yeah.
The government efforts are widespread. The tax incentives are widespread and meant to stimulate growth nationally, not just in the rural areas. You can probably guess which sectors are of prime importance. You know, agriculture is at the top of the list for domestic consumption as well as international export. Then there's tourism, of course. There are ambitious targets which remain in spite of the pandemic interruption. And there's also renewable energy, which we talked about in the first part of this series, like solar, biomass, and fusion. Healthcare is another growing area. The emphasis is on robotics, AI, and drone technology. And let's not forget manufacturing, with a focus on textiles, ceramics, and industrial machinery.
Japan has designated specific areas of the country to achieve targeted growth. Japan's National Strategic Zones program offers a variety of investment incentives to local areas.
Yeah, so there's 10 special zones in the National Strategic Zone program, and Hokkaido is not one of them. The entire island of Hokkaido is just not on the target list, and we've asked ourselves why. We couldn't come up with a specific answer. There must be one. But we also don't understand why each zone doesn't have an innovation hub or innovation incubator as designated targets. This seems like a no-brainer to us. But among our top picks, we like the idea of visa for startups, which are being actively promoted by Yabu City in Hyogo Prefecture and also Fukuoka City in Fukuoka Prefecture, and a credit guarantee system for farming, which is available in Niigata City from Niigata Prefecture. All of this said, there are opportunities in many areas, And in agribusiness, entrepreneurs can explore opportunities in things like organic farming, sustainable agriculture, and even niche crops.
You're absolutely right. And the potential for smart farming is also huge out there. Of course, traditionally, farming is done the old fashioned way. And while people use machines and some pesticides in certain situations to grow their crops, people really aren't using the full suite of smart farming. And of course, one of the key reasons for that is the fact that it's expensive.
Well, another reason is that 5G and high-speed internet is not available throughout the country yet. And that's part of the digital program that Kishida Prime Minister is trying to expand upon. So if you've got wireless access, it's easier to use drones, I think, right? But on the issue of tourism, entrepreneurs can consider developing unique accommodations, tour packages, or experience-based activities that cater to tourists. So it's not just the traditional tourism that's another opportunity in the rural area.
You know, traditionally, people came to Japan, they went to Tokyo, they went to Osaka, they might go to Hokkaido or Niigata for skiing, but they didn't really go much anyplace else. And I've looked at, tourism heat maps of where the tourists are going in Japan. And for instance, the entire Tohoku region is black. And the heat map, of course, is marked by red. So foreigners are not going to Tohoku, even though there's so much cool stuff up there.
Yeah, well, the Fukushima thing is hard to get past. I mean, it's a lot of people just are scared.
Yeah, it's really sad because Fukushima Prefecture specifically has so many awesome things. One of my favorite places to go is actually in Fukushima, and Fukushima has some of the best peaches in Japan.
I didn't know that.
Before we move on to the next topic, I wanted to mention that as tourism picks up again post-pandemic, the way that tourists behave is beginning to change, and it had already started changing before the pandemic, but we're seeing more and more tourists who want to see Japan outside of the big cities.
Yeah,
and
right.
So they want experiences, but those experiences aren't that available. And even if they are available, information about them isn't available.
Well, that's my point. As I said a moment ago, entrepreneurs, whether they're Japanese or non-Japanese, can develop unique accommodation tours or special package tours or experience-based activity tours. It's ripe for the picking. It is uncharted territory.
And it's a huge potential industry that is mainly untapped and could change the fortunes of a lot of accommodations and sightseeing spots, which are still not doing very well post-pandemic because there was 3 years of basically no income. And even before that, they weren't doing that great.
No, that's
there's
right.
a lot of tourism operations who have borrowed a lot of money from local banks or the Japan Finance Corporation, but they're not paying it back because they can't.
Right. And in all sectors, including, as I mentioned a minute ago, manufacturing. But I think business people can partner with local manufacturers to develop products, again, in niche industries, for example, eco-friendly manufacturing.
That's absolutely right. And Japan is really home to some of the most innovative and detail-oriented, high-quality manufacturing in the world. I have been on more factory tours in this country than I can count, and every time I go to one, it blows my mind how amazing the Japanese way of manufacturing is.
Precision oriented. It's the same with healthcare. Rural Japan is ripe for telemedicine, home care services, medical tourism. It's another form of tourism, right?
Yes, and that's something that Japan also could take advantage of, but the infrastructure and especially the language ability problem is really a barrier for global citizens and also global businesses looking to have some sort of presence in rural Japan. If you've got foreign employees working in rural Japan and they get sick and go to the doctor, if the doctor doesn't speak a lick of English, what are they going to do?
Well, that's right. It's a big issue. Language, again, is one of the epicenter problems here in Japan. But let's not neglect opportunities for things like renewable energy as Japan shifts toward wind, solar, geothermal, and other power generations. We talked about this in the beginning of the series. It's an immense opportunity.
Yes, renewable energy is something that Japan is definitely behind the ball on. As we mentioned in the first episode of this series, over 70% of Japan's energy is being generated by fossil fuels, and this number is actually increased due to all of the closed nuclear power plants across Japan post-Fukushima.
Which are opening up. There are 33 operable, but technically operable plants that should be and will be opened up eventually. But it's a lot less than there were before Fukushima. Some have been taken offline permanently, right?
That's
and then
correct.
There's 10%, almost 10% of Japan's energy needs are being met by solar. That's a big growth area.
It is a big growth area, but as I mentioned in the first episode, solar is not my favorite form of renewable energy. I really do think that we're on the cusp of a new generation of renewables, and I'm seeing a lot of global innovations like micro nuclear systems, as well as hydrogen fusion power, and also hydrogen power. Honda just recently announced a huge move towards hydrogen power generation that is 3 times more efficient than its predecessor. So these things will still take time and they're not going to happen tomorrow, but there are innovations happening inside and outside Japan. I think the key here is that more global businesses doing innovative things with renewable energy need to come to this market because there are so many opportunities and there is such a need. There are so many incentives.
That's it. I was just going to talk about the incentives, the grants, the tax benefits. That is what's luring a lot of companies to come here. But when they do that, they need the infrastructure. They need the land. They need the access to power storage. That's in its infancy in terms of developing on a national level.
Yeah, and things like the smart grid.
That's right.
The grid is smarter in some places than others.
Apparently it is.
And of course, Japan also operates on 2 different voltages. Did you know that?
I didn't know.
Yeah, so I think it's 50 volts in the eastern Japan and 60 volts in western Japan.
Well, there you go. In Osaka, you stand on the right. In Tokyo, you stand on the left.
Yeah, 2 different
Every
power
region
systems.
has their thing.
That's not a very good situation, but it's also something that's probably very difficult to remedy. So
yeah,
I think.
But let's be honest that Japan is ripe for disruption.
Definitely, and I think that global businesses should see Japan as a place where they can come and they can be innovative. They just have to have an entry strategy, and obviously there's the language barrier, but money fixes all problems. So, well-funded startups who want to do business in this country and bring needed innovations, come on over, baby. Bring your Amex. As we've been discussing, Japan really needs more business disruption and innovation brought on by additional risk-taking. Tax incentives, public-private partnerships, and long-term commitments are part of the magic recipe. So is loosening immigration and migration regulations, which are just too strict and stringent to fuel meaningful expansion of Japan's workforce. We also think more attention should be paid to the issue of cultural integration and acceptance, because foreigners are going to be an increasing presence. They aren't going to know the rules and norms all the time, and locals need to give them a chance and see them as equal human beings.
Yeah, that's it's a global issue, but it's particularly an issue in a homogeneous place like Japan. And it's true that Japan has historically been a closed society. It's also true that Japan has an important choice to make for its future. Watch its population decline and hope that women, AI, and robots and drones will fill the labor shortage, or continue to accept non-Japanese as partners in prosperity? And we already know the answer to that. Japan needs more immigration, more migration, or depopulation is going to continue to cause problems throughout the economy and the country.
Experience tells us that over time, most non-Japanese who want to be here are very good at adapting to Japanese culture. People who learn the Japanese language, come to understand various cultural norms, and are patient when they just can't figure out something, are more likely to be accepted by their Japanese peers.
Yes, indeed. And look, Japan remains the third largest economy in the world, right? The government plans to increase its annual investment in new, high-growth businesses more than tenfold to 10 trillion yen or 80 billion US dollars per year in order to launch 100,000 startups. That's the plan. And rural Japan is an excellent place for these startups because it's safe, it's clean, it's civil, and it's comparatively inexpensive to live and operate.
I am seeing more and more interest from companies, from startups to hospitality groups, that want to invest in the Japanese countryside. Companies can gain a lot from even just having a small satellite office in a rural area. In fact, my company Parthenon Japan has just signed a lease on the former library of a rural junior high school that was left empty for the last 10 years because of depopulation, even though the building was just built in the early 1990s. If a boutique consulting firm like us can do it, major corporations can surely do the same.
Yes, indeed.
Giving employees the opportunity to work in a totally different environment and also get more people out of Tokyo to see the potential that exists in the countryside is something that we have wanted to do since we began our Akiya and Inaka business, and it feels great that we're finally getting the ball rolling. There is still a lot of work to do, but we want to tell the world about the places, the culture, the natural beauty, and the possibilities that exist in small cities, towns, and villages across Japan that most people have never heard of.
Yeah.
And that's one of the keys. In rural Japan, it doesn't have to be greenfield investment because there are vacant homes, shops, offices, factories, and other facilities across the country. Global companies should take note of this because they can make a small investment in a rural community that can benefit their employees and also make them seen as active contributors to rural revitalization. As a public relations consultant, I think this is the biggest untapped opportunity out there right now.
You know, well said. And I was just going to say on this whole series, I'm not sure people are clear that we're not really here to promote the organization that we work with. We're really here to promote Japan because we love it here and we want it to succeed. And I think there's a lot of people who've spent decades like us here who want Japan to be more successful. We see the future and it's not very bright in a lot of areas.
Yes, I mean, as someone who is very emotionally and financially invested in Japan, there is really nowhere that I want to look but up. So in order to realize that, we have to, put on our boots and our work gloves and start screwing holes into walls.
And that's what you're doing in the rural Saitama location that you just rented.
Yeah, next week I'm going to install a TV.
And you've got a recording studio there.
Yes, the sound deadening material is on its way to Japan right now.
Well, you're living it, Parker. You're doing what you're asking people to think about doing. You're actually putting money where your mouth is.
Well, I mean, who can tell the future? But I'll tell you one thing is that I've been talking about this to various corporates for several years, and I've seen various levels of commitment. We saw lots of, very generous donations after the Tohoku disaster, but that's really disappeared after 5 years passed. And you really don't see that many companies, except for those who are based in a rural area, actively contributing to rural economies. And that's sad. And that's not just foreign companies, that's Japanese companies too.
Yeah, and then there's the real estate issue, which we've talked about in this series. We know that right now there are roughly 8 million abandoned homes throughout Japan. Some of those places are urban as well as mostly rural. And we know that the Nomura Research Institute says that 15 years from now, by 2038, if this problem is not resolved, there will be tens of millions of more homes. There'll be 22 million more abandoned homes up for sale. That's incredible. Japan, I was telling a group the other day, I was talking to a business group. I said, Japan is on sale. Japan is not for sale.
It's a 30% off sale across the country. Come one, come all.
And I showed them a picture of a house that was recently for sale for 1 million yen. The Italy's got these homes for sale for $1, right? Or a euro or whatever it is. And I think there are some of those in Japan. But there are a lot of good deals. If you want a fixer-upper, it's an endless supply. You know about this better than anybody.
I mean, it really is a land of opportunity out there in the Japanese countryside. And I hope that through this series, our listeners were able to get a sense for that. Thank you so much for listening to Japan Unleashed, and stay tuned for our next series, which is in development now. Follow us on social media by looking up Parthenon Japan on LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook to keep updated on our next series. And if you haven't already, you can follow Japan Unleashed to get updates on future episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Hey, thanks again, everyone, for listening to Japan Unleashed. It's been an incredible series. And, this is not just a pipe dream. It's a top priority for maintaining the vibrant local cultures and experiences that exist across Japan, which are loved around the world, and preserving them for future generations to enjoy is one of our goals.
Yeah, David, let's revitalize rural Japan together. Western institutions, which also happened to be, once upon a time, a lot cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, the yen was at 80 yen to the dollar about 15, 20 years ago. Now last year it hit 152, right? It's at 136 at the time of this recording. So that's a clear issue. But then there's the issue of government tax incentives for investments, which seems to be growing. But I wonder if angel investors are warming to the Japanese market. I think we're saying some evidence of that.
We are seeing some evidence, but it's really a drop in the bucket compared to other markets, even in Asia. I think that Japan continues to be a difficult nut to crack for global investors because even founders of these innovative companies oftentimes aren't fluent in English. And without the ability to effectively pitch their company and pitch the knowledge and prowess of their founders and the technology they're trying to create to global investors, how are these global investors going to say, all right, here's a check for $10 million. Go nuts, boys.
Well, there's that, which is the obvious question. And I guess the issue of public-private partnerships is another one. But ultimately, to me, sometimes I ask myself the question, should the government just get out of the way? And are any of these programs really making substantive difference? Entrepreneurs follow opportunity. And I guess the question is there real opportunity to be found in partnering with the public sector at all?
Again, this is a yes and no from my opinion. On one side, the government has put together several interesting initiatives. I think the Fukuoka Startup City Initiative is probably one of the best in the nation right now. And even Tokyo recently held a startup summit of sorts. And we also see private sector-led initiatives like Slush Tokyo, among other tech conferences that are focused on things like venture pitches. And these sort of large-scale events will have interpretation. And of course, you can attend, come overseas. And there are also foreigners coming to Japan to bring their innovations to the Japan market. So these public and private initiatives do help, but when it comes to the public sector actually financing startups, it always comes with so much paperwork and so much strings attached.
Red tape,
it's oftentimes not very attractive. So I think it depends on the innovation, and it depends on the amount of money available and what sort of public finance initiatives are available.
Yeah, we're talking about tax incentives, and tax payments make the government an automatic partner in almost every business. We see this in a place like Singapore, where the Singapore government has got plenty of money and they take a part of the business. But I mean, high taxes cut into profitability, which overall impacts business as a whole. And how about giving startups an initial amount of leeway tax-wise to succeed? I mean, that would certainly be something that would work really well in the rural areas. And this could develop into new businesses with more ability to invest more ambitiously. What do you think, Parker?
Well, it's not huge, but one thing that the Japanese government does offer is if you create a new company that has 9 million yen or under in paid-in capital, you don't have to pay consumption tax for the first 2 periods. And consumption tax, of course, is 10%.
Period meaning year, first 2 years?
Yes.
Or, I see.
Well, up to the first 2 years, your first 2 fiscal periods. So it depends on how you set your fiscal period. But that can, of course, basically give companies the ability to provide a 10% discount on any products or services they offer. In addition to that, there's also a massive undertaking by the Japanese government called the Japan Finance Corporation. This is basically the lender of first resort to new companies, and they can be extremely generous and have very low interest rates to brand new companies who otherwise would never in a billion years be able to get a proper loan from a mega bank.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't want to sound overly pessimistic here. There are good things like that happening, and there are literally hundreds of national and local projects aimed at making rural Japan more vibrant. Some are just genuinely more useful than others.
Yes, but others appear aimed more at garnering political support for Japan's ruling coalition, which sees rural votes, which statistically speaking count more than urban votes, as a means to stay in power. While this may not be unique to Japan, the result of entrenched ties to decision makers may not fully serve the interests of rural residents.
Yeah, that's probably putting it mildly. And I hope that the private sector will step up to the plate in a bigger way. However, you know, as most are ultimately motivated by profit, businesses can only contribute so much to resolving Japan's many technological and health issues. And there needs to be more private sector involvement, but the government needs to make it attractive, make an attractive proposition through its offerings in order to get advanced technology and healthcare into those rural areas.
I totally agree with you, David. Having comparable technology and healthcare to metro areas is not a nice-to-have thing, but rather an absolute necessity in order to make rural revitalization a reality. Thank you for listening to Japan Unleashed. Stay tuned for our next episode, due out in 2 weeks, where we will discuss migration and immigration issues related to rural revitalization. If you haven't already, you can subscribe to Japan Unleashed to get updates on future episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening to Japan Unleashed.